My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 66 years old. I spent 32 years as a senior claims investigator for Heritage Mutual Insurance, and in those 32 years, I caught 214 people trying to cheat a policy out of money that wasn't theirs. Not one of them was my own son. Until 3 weeks ago, when a pharmacist looked at me across the counter and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your coverage was terminated on the 4th. I stood in that pharmacy with a blood thinner prescription in my hand that I needed for a heart procedure in 11 days, and I did what I have done my entire career when a number doesn't match a story. I didn't panic. I asked for a printout. That printout had my policy number on it. My name. My signature, except it wasn't my signature. It was a photocopy of my signature, lifted from an old document and pasted onto a cancellation form. Someone had used my identity to cancel my own health insurance, and they'd done it 11 days before I was scheduled for a cardiac catheterization that could save my life or, if something went wrong on the table, could very easily end it. I've spent 3 decades finding the person behind the forged signature. This time, the person behind the forged signature was sitting at my son's kitchen table, 3 miles from my house, eating dinner with my grandchildren. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers share the moments that tested everything they built, and the quiet precision that carried them through. If you've ever trusted the wrong person with the paperwork of your own life, stay with me. This one gets worse before it gets better. Eleanor Voss. Willow Creek, Ohio. 32 years at Heritage Mutual Insurance, the last 18 of them in the Special Investigations Unit, the department that exists for one reason: to find the lie inside the paperwork before the company pays for it. I started as a claims processor at 28, the kind of job where you stamp forms and move files from one stack to another. By 34, I was investigating suspicious claims, staged car accidents, inflated fire damage, a man in Dayton who claimed his boat sank in a storm that, according to the National Weather Service, never happened. By 41, I was running audits on our own underwriters, because sometimes the fraud isn't the customer. Sometimes it's the person who's supposed to be protecting the customer. I retired at 63. 32 years. And in that time I recovered $4.7 million in fraudulent claims for the company and denied maybe twice that in claims that should never have been paid. I learned to read a document the way some people read a face. I learned that a signature under stress looks different from a signature signed at leisure. The pressure changes, the loops tighten, the pen lifts in different places. I learned that people who are lying tend to over-explain, and people who are telling the truth tend to just answer the question. I did not know, when I retired, that I would need every single one of those skills again. I thought I was done. I thought the filing cabinets in my den held the last case I'd ever build. I was wrong. I built one more. This one was about my own life. My husband Walter was a mechanical engineer for the Ohio Department of Transportation for 34 years. Bridges, mostly, inspection, load ratings, the kind of work where a mistake means a structure fails and people die, so you don't make mistakes. Walter and I were married 41 years. We met at a church potluck in 1979 when I was 24 and he was 27. And he told me later that what caught his attention wasn't my face, it was that I'd organized the dessert table by category before anyone asked me to. He liked order. So did I. It's why our marriage worked for 4 decades without a single serious fight about money. We both understood that money isn't emotional, it's just a record of decisions, and if you keep the record clean, the emotions take care of themselves. Walter died 6 years ago. A stroke, sudden, on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the paper at our kitchen table. I was in the next room. By the time I reached him, it was already over. He was 68. We'd been planning to visit our grandchildren in Columbus that weekend. After Walter died, I did what I always do when the ground shifts. I organized. I went through every policy, every account, every document in our house, and I built a binder, not out of grief management, out of pure professional habit. 32 years of insurance work teaches you that death creates chaos in paperwork faster than anywhere else, and chaos in paperwork is where people get robbed, either by strangers or, more often, by family. I built that binder to protect myself from exactly what happened to me anyway. Which tells you something about how good the person who robbed me actually was, or how much I trusted the wrong person to never need protecting from. We had one child. Derek. 39 years old now. Derek owns a small HVAC and refrigeration repair business, Boss Climate Solutions, for employees, a leased warehouse off Route 9. He was a steady kid growing up, not academic, not athletic, just reliable. He'd fix things. Neighbors' lawnmowers, my garbage disposal, the church furnace. Walter used to say Derek had hands that listened, meaning he could take something apart, understand why it was broken, and put it back together better than he found it. I was proud of him for going into a trade instead of chasing a 4-year degree he didn't want. He started the business at 29 with an $18,000 loan from Walter and me, which he paid back in full, on schedule, every month, for 6 years. I want that on the record, because it matters later. My son was not a man with a pattern of taking what wasn't his. That's what made this so hard to see coming, and so hard to accept once I did. Derek married Sabrina 8 years ago. Courthouse ceremony, small reception at the VFW Hall, the same hall where half of Willow Creek gets married because it's cheap and the parking lot is big. Sabrina Voss, 35 now, grew up outside Cincinnati. Her father ran a used car lot that went under twice before she turned 16. Her mother worked the counter at a dry cleaner. Sabrina told me once, early in her marriage to Derek, that she remembered exactly what it felt like the first time the power got shut off in her house. She was 9, and she remembers her mother lighting candles and telling her it was an adventure. Sabrina said she never once believed it was an adventure. She said she decided that night that she would never again let anyone see her family running out of money. I want to be fair to Sabrina here, the way I try to be fair to everyone in a fraud file, because understanding the motive isn't the same as excusing the act. Sabrina was the oldest of 3, and she told me once, on one of the rare evenings she let her guard down over a glass of wine at my kitchen table, that she'd started babysitting at 11 and handed most of the money straight to her mother without being asked, because she'd learned to read the particular quiet that meant the electric bill was due before anyone said a word about it out loud. She graduated high school with a partial scholarship to a state school and lost it after 2 semesters when her father's second dealership failed and she had to come home to help. She never finished the degree. She worked retail for 6 years, good at merchandising, good at making a mediocre store look like it belonged in a magazine, and I think that skill, more than any single decision, is the one that eventually built both her marriage and her downfall. She has always known exactly how to make something look worth more than it is. Sabrina didn't marry my son for money. Derek doesn't have money, not real money, not HVAC repair business money. She married him because he was steady, and steady, to a woman who grew up watching candles get lit as a coping mechanism, looks a great deal like safety. But steady wasn't enough for Sabrina in the long run. Steady doesn't post well. Steady doesn't look like anything on a page. And somewhere in the last 4 years, Sabrina had built a second life that Derek didn't fully understand, and that I understood only because I have spent 3 decades reading the difference between what people say they're spending and what they're actually spending. 2 years ago, Sabrina opened a small boutique called Sable Sage, candles, home decor, curated lifestyle goods, The kind of shop that photographs beautifully and loses money quietly. She funded the opening within $22,000 personal loan Derek didn't know about until 11 months in, when the collector calls started. By the time I learned the full number, Sable Sage owed $61,000 across 2 credit lines and 1 high-interest personal loan, and it had been closed for 4 months, the merchandise liquidated at a loss, the storefront lease broken with a penalty. Sabrina had told Derek the shop just needed a little more time to find its audience. She had not told him it was already dead, or how much it owed, or that she'd started making minimum payments on the debt using a credit card that wasn't in Derek's name and that Derek, therefore, never saw a statement for. I found all of this later. I want you to understand that when the pharmacist told me my insurance had been cancelled, I did not know any of it yet. I only knew that someone had forged my signature on an insurance document 11 days before a procedure I needed to stay alive, and I intended to find out exactly who, exactly how, and exactly why, the same way I had found out those 3 things 214 times before for a company that was never even paying me to care as much as I cared this time. Here is the part of the story that matters most, the part that made this fraud possible in the first place. And it starts 3 years ago. Not 3 weeks ago. 3 years ago, I had what my cardiologist called a mild cardiac event, not quite a heart attack, but close enough that everyone in the family got frightened, including me. I spent 2 nights in the hospital. When I came home, Derek sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where Walter used to read the paper, and he said, "Mom, what if something happens and you're not able to deal with the insurance company yourself? What if you're in the hospital and you can't answer their questions?" It was a reasonable fear. It was, frankly, the exact fear I'd have had if I were in his position, because I'd spent 32 years watching what happens to elderly policyholders who lose the ability to advocate for themselves during a crisis. Claims get denied, premiums lapse, families get billed for things that should have been covered, all because nobody had the authority to intervene in real time. So I did something I now understand was the single mistake at the center of this entire story. I called Heritage Mutual, my former employer, where I still had personal relationships in 3 departments, and I had Derek added to my supplemental health policy as an authorized representative. Not a policyholder. Not a beneficiary. An authorized representative, which meant he could call on my behalf, discuss my account, and, this is the part one did not think through carefully enough, the part 32 years of catching other people's mistakes did not stop me from making myself request changes to the policy, including cancellation, without needing my signature in person, provided he could produce identifying information and a signed authorization form. I trusted my son with a level of access I would have flagged as a red flag on any other file that crossed my desk in 3 decades. I did it because he is my son, and because the fear of dying alone in a hospital bed with no one able to speak for me felt, at 63, more real than the fear of my son ever doing what he eventually did. I want to say that plainly, because a story like this one only makes sense if you understand that the wound wasn't stupidity. The wound was love, extended 1 degree too far, to a person who did not himself intend to hurt me, but who let someone else use that access as a door. The policy in question was not an ordinary supplemental plan. It was a hybrid long-term care and life policy Walter and I purchased together in 1998, the kind that isn't common anymore because insurers stopped writing them. They were too generous to the policyholder. It had a cash accumulation component. Premiums we'd paid for 25 years had built an internal cash value, and the policy had a maturity clause. If maintained without lapse until my 70th birthday, it would pay out a guaranteed $86,000 lump sum on top of ongoing long-term care coverage, structured originally as a nest egg for whichever of us outlived the other. Walter was gone. The $86,000 was mine, for years from vesting, and it existed entirely because I had spent a quarter of a century paying $340 a month into an account that most people, including apparently my own son, assumed was just mom's health insurance. I remember the year we bought it. Walter had just been promoted to senior bridge inspector, and we sat at a card table in our old apartment with an insurance agent named Mr. Petrosky, who is probably long retired or long gone by now, and Walter said, "Ellie, let's build something we don't touch. Something that just sits there and grows, and whichever one of us is left gets a soft landing." I remember thinking it was almost too sentimental a thing for Walter to say out loud, because he was not a sentimental man in his words, only in his choices. We signed the paperwork that same afternoon and never once, in 25 years, missed a payment or borrowed against it, even in years when money was tight, even the year Derek's braces cost more than either of us expected. That policy was the one account in our entire financial life that we agreed, out loud, in front of Mr. Petrosky's card table, we would never let anyone touch before it was ready. I did not think anyone would ever include my own son. It was not just mom's health insurance. It was $86,000 sitting 4 years from a payout, and it had a surrender clause that meant if the policy was cancelled early, the cash value did not go to me. It converted into a surrender payment calculated at a steep discount, paid out to whoever initiated the cancellation and was listed as authorized on the account, minus penalties. I am going to say that number plainly because it is the number that made my son's household solvent for exactly 11 days before I found out. The surrender payout Heritage Mutual issued upon cancellation was $52,400. It was deposited into an account controlled by Derek on March the 4th, and by March the 9th, $48,000 of it was gone. Now let me take you back to the day I found out, because that's where this story actually begins for you, the way it began for me. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray Ohio Tuesday where the sky doesn't commit to rain or sun. I drove to Beacon Pharmacy on Main Street the way I have for 11 years, to pick up a refill for the blood thinner my cardiologist had prescribed ahead of a scheduled catheterization, 11 days out at that point, to check a narrowing his last scan had flagged in one of my coronary arteries. Nothing life-threatening yet. Nothing to ignore either. The kind of procedure where you want every piece of your care running exactly on time. The pharmacist, a young man named Priyesh who's filled my prescriptions since he started there, looked at his screen, then looked at me, then looked at his screen again in the way you look at something twice when you're hoping it'll say something different the second time. "Mrs. Boss, I'm showing your coverage is terminated. Effective March 4th. I told him that was impossible. I have carried that policy for over a quarter of a century. I have never missed a payment. I told him to run it again. He did. Same result. Termination code, effective date March 4th, reason listed as policyholder request, cancellation. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me, professionally, before it did anything to me personally. Policyholder request. I am the policyholder. I did not request anything. 32 years of reading exactly that kind of language on exactly that kind of form told me immediately that either the system had made an error, vanishingly rare, and I would know, because I used to audit that system, or someone had impersonated me. I paid out of pocket for that refill. $214 for 30 days, a medication that should have cost me a $12 copay. I drove home and I did not cry, and I did not call Derek first, because 32 years of training does not let you call the person closest to the paperwork before you've looked at the paperwork yourself. I went to my den, the same den where I built the binder after Walter died, and I opened my filing cabinet, and I pulled every document related to that policy going back to 1998. Then I called Heritage Mutual's policyholder services line and asked, calmly, for a full transaction history and a copy of the cancellation form. As a former employee of 32 years with personal relationships still active in 3 departments, this was not a request I had to fight for. Within 4 hours, I had it in my email inbox. A 1-page cancellation authorization form, dated March 4th, listing my policy number, my full legal name, and a signature. I looked at that signature for a long time. I have looked at thousands of signatures in my career, comparing them against known exemplars, checking for the small mechanical tells that separate a genuine signature from a traced or copied one, the pen pressure, the stroke order, the tiny variations that happen naturally when a hand signs its own name versus when a hand copies someone else's. This signature was too perfect. My signature has a small hook on the final N in Voss, a habit from my mother that I've never broken. This signature had it too, in exactly the same place, at exactly the same angle, which told me immediately it wasn't written, it was traced, or worse, it was digitally lifted from an existing document and pasted onto a new one. A real signature, written twice by the same hand 10 minutes apart, will never land in the exact same place with the exact same pressure. A copied signature will. Someone had taken an image of my actual signature, probably from an old document, possibly from the authorization form I'd signed 3 years earlier adding Derek as a representative, and used it to fabricate a cancellation request that looked, to an ordinary claims processor working a normal Tuesday, entirely legitimate. I called the claims department directly and asked who had submitted the form. The answer came back within the hour, because I still knew exactly which extension to call and exactly which supervisor could pull an audit log without a 2-week wait. The cancellation had been submitted by phone on March 4th at 2:47 p.m., by a caller who identified himself using Derek's authorized representative credentials, his name, his date of birth, the last 4 digits of his own social security number, and my policy number, which he had legitimate access to as my representative. The call had been recorded. I requested the recording. I sat in my den that evening and I listened to a recording of my son's voice canceling my health insurance, requesting the surrender value be paid out, and providing a bank account for the deposit that was not my account and was not Derek's business account. It was a joint account. Sabrina's name was on it too. I did not call Derek that night. I sat with it. 32 years of investigation work teaches you the most dangerous thing you can do with a piece of evidence is act on it before you understand its full shape. I had 1 recording, 1 forged signature, 1 bank account. I did not yet have the why, and the why, in my experience, is always the difference between a mistake you can forgive and a scheme you cannot. I want to pause here and tell you what I did not do, because I think it matters. I did not confront my son in a rage. I did not call the police that night. I did not cancel my cardiac procedure out of fear, though God knows the stress of that week made the 11 days until my catheterization feel like walking a plank. I did the thing 32 years of training built into me at a level deeper than instinct. I opened a file. I titled it, out of old habit, the way I used to title every suspicious claim at Heritage Mutual, Boss, E, Policy 447-1209, Unauthorized Cancellation Investigation. Then I got to work. The next morning, I drove to my bank, not Heritage Mutual, my personal bank, and requested 6 months of statements on every account I held, cross-referenced against every automatic payment linked to the canceled policy. I confirmed the $340 monthly premium had been drafting from my account exactly on schedule, every month, without fail, for over 2 decades. There had never been a missed payment, never a lapse, never a reason for the policy to require cancellation for non-payment. This was not a lapse. This was a deliberate act, executed by someone who understood exactly how much money was sitting in that policy's cash value and exactly how to get their hands on it before I turned 70, and it paid out to me directly. I called Heritage Mutual again and requested the surrender payout details. $52,400, deposited March 4th into an account ending in 6631. I do not have access to my son's private banking, obviously, but I did not need direct access, because 5 days later, sitting at Sunday dinner at Derek and Sabrina's house, the dinner I still attended every week, the way I always had, because I had not yet decided how to handle what I knew, I watched Sabrina hand Derek her phone to show him a photo of a car. Not a used car. A 2024 Ford Explorer, dealer sticker still visible in the reflection of the photo, parked outside a dealership 40 minutes from Willow Creek. Sabrina said, "They're holding it for us until Thursday, we just need to finalize financing." Derek said, "We talked about this, Sab, we can't right now." And Sabrina said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about who had actually spent my 86,000 nest egg down to 4,405 days. She said, "Derek, we have the money. I told you, it's handled." I sat at that table with a fork in my hand and a grandson asking me to pass the rolls, and I understood, with the calm clarity I used to feel in the moment a fraud file finally clicked into place after weeks of scattered pieces, that my son's wife knew exactly where 52,400 of my money had come from, and my son either knew and was lying to himself about it, or genuinely did not yet understand what he'd done. I needed to know which. Understanding the difference between a man who commits fraud and a man who is used to commit fraud isn't sentiment. It's the entire basis for how you build a case, and it's the entire basis for how much mercy that case deserves. Let me tell you about Sabrina's debt, because I did not learn about Sable Sage from a dinner conversation. I learned about it the way I learned about every fraud in my career. I traced the money. I want to explain something about how claims investigation actually works, because it isn't glamorous, it's patient. You do not find fraud by suspecting someone and confronting them. You find it by building a complete, silent picture of every transaction until the picture tells you a story no single document could tell alone. I spent the next 9 days doing exactly that, the same 9 days that were supposed to be the calm lead-up to my cardiac procedure, except now I was running 2 operations at once, managing my own health, and managing a case that had my son's name on the suspect line. I still had access, as a 32-year retiree with strong personal relationships, to a records request specialist at Heritage Mutual named Colette Fairbanks, who had trained under me in 2009 and who owed me, by her own words, about 100 favors I'll never be able to repay. I asked Colette for the complete call log and correspondence history on my policy for the previous 18 months. It came back showing 3 prior calls from Derek's authorized rep line that I had never known about, one in October asking about the current cash surrender value, one in December asking what documentation was required to process a full cancellation, and the final one in March, the one that executed it. This was not an impulsive act. This was a man who had spent 5 months finding out exactly how much money was sitting in his mother's name and exactly what paperwork it would take to get it out. I want to be honest about how that felt, because a fraud file doesn't hurt you. A son's 5-month plan does. I sat with that timeline for a long time before I moved to the next step, because I needed to separate the professional part of me, the part that reads a timeline and simply records it, from the part of me that was a mother reading her own child's calculation of how much her life was worth in dollars and how soon he could access it. I called Marlene Petrov next. Marlene was my closest colleague at Heritage Mutual for 11 years, a fraud examiner who specialized in beneficiary and family account abuse, cases exactly like mine, cases where an authorized representative or power of attorney uses legitimate access as a door for illegitimate withdrawal. Marlene retired the year after I did, and she now consults privately, testifies as an expert witness, the whole practice built on the exact skill set my own son had just used against me. I met Marlene at her kitchen table in Dublin, Ohio, with the entire file spread out between us the way we used to spread files out at the office. Marlene read the cancellation form, the signature comparison, the call recording transcript, the bank statement showing the $52,400 deposit and the rapid drawdown to $4,400 within 5 days. "Eleanor," she said, "this isn't a gray area. This is felony-level elder financial exploitation under Ohio law, and it's insurance fraud on top of it, forged signature, impersonation to a financial institution, unauthorized transfer of funds. If this were a stranger's file, you'd have already referred it to the Fraud Bureau. I know what it is, Marlene. I need to know who did it and why before I decide what it's going to be." "You already know who submitted the call." "I know who made the call. I don't yet know who made the plan." Marlene looked at me the way she used to look at a case that was about to get uncomfortable in a new direction. "You think it's the wife?" "I think," I said, "that my son has never in his life spent 5 months quietly researching a way to take money from me. And I think his wife has spent the last 2 years quietly losing $61,000 nobody in this family knew about until 11 days ago. I need to explain how I found the $61,000, because it matters, and because it's the part of this investigation that took the longest and required the most patience." Sabrina's boutique, Sable Sage, had been publicly listed on the county business registry, which meant its formation date, its registered agent, and its dissolution filing were all public record. A 15-minute trip to the Franklin County Recorder's website told me it had opened 2 years ago and formally dissolved 4 months ago. That told me the shop had already failed before the insurance cancellation ever happened, which meant the $52,400 wasn't funding a new venture. It was covering old damage. The debt itself I could not access directly. I am not on Sabrina's credit accounts, and I would never have pursued this the way I did if my grandson's stability and my own forged signature weren't sitting at the center of it. But I did not need direct access. Derek, in a moment I still believe was pure exhaustion rather than any intent to help me build a case against his own wife, mentioned it himself, at that same Sunday dinner, 3 weeks after the cancellation, when I finally asked him directly how business was going. "Honestly, Mom, it's been a rough year. Sabrina's shop didn't work out the way we hoped, and it turns out it cost more to close than it did to run. We're still catching up on some of it." "How much, Derek?" He looked at his plate. "It's handled now. That's the important part. It's handled now." The same phrase Sabrina had used about the Ford Explorer. I understood, sitting there, that handled was the family's word for my $86,000. I confirmed the number 2 weeks later through a source I am not proud of using but do not regret using either, a former Heritage Mutual colleague who now works in consumer lending compliance and who, without disclosing anything protected, confirmed on background that a debt consolidation inquiry had been run under Sabrina Voss's name in the prior year showing revolving balances in the $60,000 range across 3 lines. That was enough, combined with the dissolved LLC filing and the timeline of calls to my policy, to build the complete picture. Sable Sage had failed. Sabrina had hidden the extent of the debt from Derek for the better part of a year. And when the collection calls became unmanageable, someone had remembered that Derek had access to a policy worth $86,000 in his mother's name, for years from vesting, and had decided 4 years was too long to wait. I do not know for certain, even now, which of them first said the words "we could use Mom's policy." I know only that Derek made the call, using his own voice, his own identifying information, and a forged copy of my signature that someone had to physically produce, screenshot, print, trace, or digitally paste onto a blank authorization form. I know that the deposit account was joint. I know that the money was spent in 5 days on debt repayment and a down payment on a vehicle. Derek himself had told Sabrina, on tape at my own dinner table, that they couldn't afford. And I know that not $1 of it was spent trying to protect my health coverage, despite the fact that the policy they cancelled was the very thing standing between me and a $9,000 out-of-pocket bill for the catheterization I still had scheduled. Which brings me to Dr. Amos Whitfield, no relation to Walter, an unfortunate coincidence of surnames I've always found strangely comforting, my cardiologist for the last 9 years. I called his office the day after the pharmacy incident and explained the situation. His office manager, a woman named Renata who has fielded my scheduling for nearly a decade, told me flatly, "Mrs. Voss, we are not canceling this procedure over an insurance dispute. We will bill you directly and you can settle it with the insurance company after, because your artery isn't going to wait for paperwork." I want that on the record too, because Renata's small act of professional stubbornness may have saved my life more directly than anything I did with a filing cabinet. The procedure went forward on schedule. It went well. The narrowing was treated with a stent, an outpatient recovery, and I was back in my den 3 days later, finishing the file. I called Helen Marsh, an elder law attorney in Columbus who specializes in financial exploitation cases, the same week. Helen had handled the estate paperwork after Walter died, and she remembered me as, in her words, the most organized widow I've ever represented, by a wide margin. I brought her the complete file, the forged signature comparison, the call recording transcript, the cancellation form, the bank statement showing the deposit and drawdown, the LLC dissolution filing, the debt consolidation inquiry, and a timeline document I'd built the way Heritage Mutual trained me to build every case summary, 1 page, top of the file, findings first. Helen read for 40 minutes without speaking, the way people who understand what they're looking at tend to go quiet. "Eleanor, this is textbook elder financial exploitation under Ohio Revised Code. Forgery, insurance fraud, and depending on how a prosecutor wants to charge the phone impersonation, potentially identity theft as well. You have documentary evidence, a recorded call, and a clean chain of custody on everything. You could refer this to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Elder Abuse Unit this afternoon and they would open a case." "I know. You don't sound like a woman who's about to do that." "I'm not ready to decide yet. I want the complete picture first." "Eleanor, you have 32 years of experience telling you the complete picture is already sitting in that folder. The complete picture includes what happens to my grandson if his father goes to prison. I need to know exactly how much leverage I have before I decide how much of it to use." Helen prepared 2 things for me that week, the same way an attorney prepares options rather than mandates. First, a formal letter on her letterhead stating that she had reviewed sufficient evidence of forgery and elder financial exploitation to support both a criminal referral and a civil claim for recovery of the surrendered policy value, and that both remained available pending my decision. Second, a restitution and repayment agreement, drafted but unsigned, structured so that if I chose the private resolution path, Derek and Sabrina would be legally bound to repay the full $52,400, plus the difference between what the policy would have paid at full maturity and what it paid on early surrender, because Heritage Mutual's actuarial team confirmed for me, once I asked as a former employee with the standing to ask, that the surrender penalty had cost the family an additional $33,600 in value that simply evaporated the moment the cancellation was processed. The total harm, by the numbers, was not $52,400. It was $86,000, the full maturity value I would have received on my 70th birthday, now gone entirely, unless the account itself could somehow be reinstated within Heritage Mutual's reinstatement window. I called Colette Fairbanks one more time and asked the question that mattered most. If a policyholder's cancellation is proven fraudulent, If the signature is confirmed forged and the request is confirmed unauthorized, can the policy be reinstated at its pre-cancellation value? If we can substantiate the fraud internally within 90 days of the cancellation date, yes. We treat it as a void transaction, not a lapse. You'd be restored to the account as if the cancellation never happened, cash value intact, maturity date intact. I was 19 days into that 90-day window. I want you to hold on to that number, because it is the number that decided everything that happened next. I did not have the luxury of taking my time the way I normally would have. I had 71 days left to either resolve this quietly within the family or refer the fraud formally to Heritage Mutual's Internal Investigations Unit, which would trigger a mandatory report to Ohio's Department of Insurance and, almost certainly, a parallel report to law enforcement given the dollar amount and the age of the victim. 71 days to decide whether my son's household survived this intact. I called Dorothy Kessler, my closest friend for over 30 years, the woman who sat beside me at Walter's funeral and did not say a single wrong thing the entire day, which is rarer than people think. Dorothy was a middle school guidance counselor for 26 years before she retired, and if there is one skill that rivals a fraud investigator's ability to read a lie, it's a guidance counselor's ability to read a room full of people who are all lying to themselves at once. Dorothy, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. You know I don't like that opener. I know. This one earns it. I told her everything. The pharmacy, the forged signature, the recorded call, Sabrina's boutique, the Ford Explorer, the 90-day reinstatement window. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment after I finished, longer than I'd ever heard her go quiet. Eleanor, why didn't you call me the day you found out? Because I needed the case to be complete before I told anyone. Even you. That's how I built every file I've ever worked. You're not at Heritage Mutual anymore. No. But the habits are the same, Dorothy. And this time they might be the only thing standing between my grandson having two parents in this house and having one. Dorothy was quiet again, the particular quiet I'd come to recognize from 3 decades of watching her handle other people's worst days in her old office at Willow Creek Middle School, a room that always smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and construction paper. Can I tell you something as your friend and not as a guidance counselor? You've never once managed to separate the two, Dorothy. Go ahead. I think you're not just building a case. I think you're trying to figure out how to still be his mother after you finish being his investigator. And I think you're scared those two things might not fit in the same body. I didn't answer her right away, because she was right, and I have never been quick to admit when someone else has named something truer than what I'd have said myself. I don't know how to be both yet, I finally told her. I only know how to be thorough first and figure out the rest after. That's always been your way, Eleanor. Thorough first. It got you through Walter. I imagine it'll get you through this too. Just don't let thorough be the only thing left standing when it's over. What do you need from me? A witness. When I present this, I need someone in the room who isn't family, isn't the attorney, and can't be accused later of having a stake in the outcome. You know I'll be there. That was Dorothy. No speech. Just the answer, the way the best people give it. I spent the final week before the dinner building the physical file the way Heritage Mutual trained every investigator on my team to build a closing summary, because a case that isn't organized to be understood by someone seeing it for the first time isn't finished, no matter how much evidence it contains. I bought a navy binder with a spine label, the same style I'd used for 214 cases over 18 years in special investigations. I built 5 tabs. Tab 1, the cancellation form and the signature comparison, my genuine signature from 4 exemplar documents laid beside the forged one, with the identical hook on the final end circled in red on both, the mechanical proof that one had been copied from the other rather than independently written. Tab 2, the call recording transcript, printed in full, timestamped, with Derek's voice quotes highlighted, including the moment he provided the deposit account ending in 6631. Tab 3, the bank statement showing the $52,400 deposit on March 4 and the drawdown to $4,400 by March 9, cross-referenced against Sable Sage's dissolution filing and the debt consolidation inquiry showing approximately $61,000 in prior revolving debt under Sabrina's name. I invited the family to Sunday dinner at my house, the way I always had, nothing unusual in the invitation itself. Derek, Sabrina, my 2 grandchildren, Miles, 7, and Corinne, 4, Dorothy, and, though none of them knew it yet, Helen Marsh, who arrived 15 minutes before the others and sat quietly in my kitchen with her briefcase while I finished setting the table. I made pot roast. Walter's favorite, which had become, over the years, everyone's favorite, the meal I make when I need a kitchen that smells like something steady while everything else in the room is about to become unsteady. I set the table with the good plates, the wedding china neither Derek nor Sabrina had ever seen me use for an ordinary Sunday, because I wanted them to understand, without a single word yet spoken, that this was not an ordinary Sunday. I asked Dorothy to take the children to the den after dinner, the tablet loaded with a show, the door closed. Miles complained, briefly, about missing the grown-up conversation, the way 7-year-olds do, and I told him Grandma had some boring paperwork to talk about with his parents, which was, in its way, the truest thing I said that entire evening. I placed the navy binder on the table next to the serving dish, the way I once placed 214 case files on 214 desks across from 214 people who thought, until the moment the folder opened, that they had gotten away with something. I want to talk about your father's Heritage Mutual policy, I said. Policy number 447-1209. Derek's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sabrina's face did the thing I have watched 1,000 faces do across a table when the room shifts and they haven't yet decided whether to perform confusion or perform concern. She chose concern first. Mom, is everything okay with your insurance? I thought that got sorted out. It didn't get sorted out, Sabrina. It got cancelled. On March 4th. Using a forged copy of my signature and a phone call placed by my son. The table went silent the way a table goes silent only once in a family's life, if it's lucky enough to only need it once. I opened tab 1. This is my actual signature, from 4 documents on file with Heritage Mutual going back 15 years. This is the signature on the cancellation form. Notice the hook on the final letter of my last name, the exact same angle, the exact same pressure, in the exact same place, on a form dated 11 days apart from the last time I actually signed my own name. A hand doesn't do that twice, Derek. A photocopier does. Derek's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Mom, I can explain. I'm not finished. My voice stayed level, the same cadence I used to read a claims summary aloud to a room full of underwriters who did not want to hear it. This is a transcript of the call placed to Heritage Mutual on March 4th at 2:47 p.m., requesting cancellation and surrender of the policy. The caller identified himself using your name, your date of birth, and the last 4 digits of your social security number. The caller requested the surrender payment be deposited into an account ending in 6631. That account is joint. Both of your names are on it. Sabrina spoke first, the way she always spoke first when Derek went quiet. Eleanor, I think you're misunderstanding a paperwork issue. Derek had authorization on that policy. That's not fraud, that's just authorization to represent me, Sabrina. Not authorization to forge my signature and cancel a policy I never asked to cancel, and certainly not authorization to redirect $52,000 of my money into an account I've never had access to. I opened tab 3. This is the bank statement showing that deposit. And this is the same account, 5 days later, showing a balance of $4,400. I let that sit the way I always let a number sit. Numbers are loud enough on their own when they're this ugly. Where did $52,000 go in 5 days? Derek looked at his plate. Sabrina looked at Derek. Sabrina, I said, I know about Sable Sage. I know it dissolved 4 months ago. I know it left behind approximately $61,000 in debt across 3 credit lines, debt you did not disclose to my son until the collection calls became unmanageable. I know because a business dissolution is public record, and because 5 days after this deposit, you were showing my son a photo of a Ford Explorer at a dealership and telling him, in my own dining room, that the money was handled. Sabrina's composed face cracked for the first time. You've been investigating me. I've been investigating the theft of my own health insurance 11 days before a cardiac procedure, Sabrina. You happened to be standing in the middle of it. Derek finally spoke, his voice smaller than I had heard it since he was a teenager caught in a lie about where the car had been at 2 a.m. Mom, I wasn't trying to hurt you. Sabrina told me the debt was going to ruin us. The collectors were calling the shop. They were talking about garnishing my business accounts. I panicked. I knew about the cash value in the policy because you'd mentioned it once, years ago, and I thought I'd figure out a way to pay it back before you ever needed it, before you turned 70. I thought I had time. You had 4 years, Derek. You spent 5 months planning how to take it in 5 days instead. I have the call log. October, December, March. You didn't panic in a moment. You researched a solution for 5 months and the solution you chose was your mother's life insurance policy. I didn't forge the signature, he said, and for the first time that evening, I believed something he said completely, because his eyes went straight to Sabrina when he said it. I never touched your signature, Mom. I gave them my information, my authorization, but I don't even know how someone would. I opened my laptop, the folder Colette had helped me prepare, and turned the screen toward the table. Heritage Mutual's authorization form for representative changes, from 3 years ago, the one I signed adding you to the account. Here's my signature on that original form. Here's the signature on the cancellation form. They're not just similar, Sabrina. They're identical, pixel for pixel, when I overlay them. Someone took a photo or scan of this original document and pasted my signature onto a new one. Derek didn't have this document. I never gave it to him. But it lived in a shared email account that both of your names are on, from the year I forwarded a copy to Derek for the file, because that's the kind of organized person I am. The table went quiet again, and this time, Sabrina didn't try to fill it. You forged my signature, Sabrina, I said. Not Derek. You. And you let him make the call, because Heritage Mutual would only accept the cancellation from the authorized representative's voice, which meant you needed him to do it, and I don't believe for 1 second that you told him the full truth about what he was authorizing when you handed him a form with my signature already on it. Sabrina's eyes filled, and for a moment I watched her calculate, the way I've watched 214 people calculate at a table just like this one, whether tears would work as a strategy. You don't understand what it's like, she said. I grew up watching my parents lose everything twice. I was not going to let that happen to my kids. I was not going to let Miles and Corinne watch the power get shut off. I did something wrong, I know that, but I did it because I was terrified, not because I don't love this family. I let that sit too, because it deserved to sit, the same way I let every honest confession sit in 32 years of interviews before I responded to it. Understanding fear is not the same as excusing what fear produces. I believe you were terrified, Sabrina. I believe growing up the way you did left a wound that never fully closed. I understand fear. I have sat with real fear myself, more than once. But fear does not give you the right to forge a dying woman's, a sick woman's, signature and take $86,000 out of her future to cover a debt you hid from your own husband for a year. Terror explains what you did. It does not excuse it. And it certainly doesn't explain why, once the money was in your account, you spent it on a car instead of coming to me and telling me the truth. Derek's voice cracked. You would have helped us. If we'd just asked, you would have helped us. Derek, I would have signed a check that same night if either of you had sat at this table and told me the truth. I have 86,000 reasons to have helped you honestly. Instead, you forged my name, canceled the one thing standing between me and a $9,000 hospital bill 11 days before a heart procedure, and let your wife buy a car with the difference. You didn't just take my money. You gambled with my health to get it, whether you understood that part or not. I opened tab 5. This is the actuarial letter from Heritage Mutual. The cancellation didn't just cost $52,000. It cost the full maturity value of the policy, $86,000, because early surrender forfeits the growth that would have paid out on my 70th birthday. That's the real number. 86,000, not 52. Helen Marsh spoke for the first time, calm, professional, the way an attorney speaks when the emotional weather in a room needs an anchor. I've reviewed the full file. What's been described here constitutes forgery, insurance fraud, and financial exploitation of an elderly person under Ohio law. Eleanor has grounds to refer this to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Elder Abuse Unit today. She also has grounds for a civil claim to recover the full $86,000 loss, plus damages. Those options remain on the table pending her decision tonight. Sabrina's face went white. You brought a lawyer to dinner. I brought a witness to the truth, Sabrina, the same way you brought a fabricated version of yourself to my dinner table for 8 years. I'm not filing charges tonight. I let the relief start to land on Derek's face before I continued, because I needed him to feel it and then feel exactly how conditional it was. I'm not filing charges if the following happens. I turned to a clean page in the binder, one I had written that afternoon, and read it the way I used to read a settlement offer to a claims department that did not want to hear the number. 1. The full $86,000 is repaid to me, not the 52 that was taken, the full maturity value that was lost. I don't care if it takes 5 years on a payment plan. Helen will draft the schedule. 2. Heritage Mutual has confirmed the policy can be reinstated at full value if fraud is substantiated within 90 days of cancellation, and we are 19 days past that cancellation date, which leaves 71 days. I am filing a formal internal fraud report with Heritage Mutual this week, using this exact file, to reinstate the policy. That report will name both of you as the parties responsible. It will not go to law enforcement unless the repayment plan is broken. But it will exist, on record, permanently, at the company. 3. Sabrina, you will disclose the full extent of any remaining debt to Derek, in writing, witnessed by Helen, before another dollar of family money moves through any account either of you controls. 4. The Ford Explorer is returned or sold, and the proceeds go toward the repayment plan. 5. No further access to my accounts, my policies, or my authorization for either of you, effective tonight. I will find another arrangement for emergencies, one that does not run through this house. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and, faintly, cartoon voices from behind the den door. "If any part of this isn't honored," I said, closing the binder, "Helen files everything. The forgery, the fraud report, the civil claim. This conversation happens in a courtroom instead of my dining room, and I promise you both, a courtroom will not be as kind to you as I have been tonight." Derek's shoulders had folded forward, his hands pressed flat against his face. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't have any excuse. I let myself believe it was a solution instead of a theft because calling it a theft meant admitting what I'd done to you." "I know, Derek. That's the part one actually believe." "Sabrina didn't apologize that night. She said, quietly, staring at the tablecloth, 'I'll sign whatever you need me to sign,' which is not the same thing, and I noted the difference the way I've noted the difference in 214 other rooms, but I didn't push for more than the room had left to give. I stood, picked up the binder, and said the only thing left to say. 'There's pie in the kitchen. Help yourselves before you go.'" Helen stayed another 20 minutes to walk through the repayment schedule in plain terms while Derek and Sabrina sat, drained, at the far end of the table. Dorothy came out of the den once the children had fallen asleep in front of the tablet, and she didn't ask how it had gone. She just squeezed my shoulder on her way to the kitchen, which was its own kind of answer. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my den with the binder closed on my desk, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I let myself cry, not from the fraud, and not even entirely from the fear of the last 11 days before my procedure, but from the particular grief of realizing your own child is capable of something you spent 32 years catching other people doing to strangers. I want to be honest that this part didn't resolve itself neatly the way the paperwork did. Some griefs you file. This one I just had to carry for a while. Here is how it settled, in the weeks and months after. I filed the internal fraud report with Heritage Mutual 8 days later, using the complete file, and Colette Fairbanks personally walked it through the substantiation review. 59 days into the 90-day window, the reinstatement was approved. My policy was restored to its pre-cancellation status, the full cash value, the original maturity date, for years out, my 70th birthday, $86,000 waiting exactly where Walter and I had built it to wait. Heritage Mutual's internal fraud unit noted the case, per their standard procedure, but because I chose not to escalate to a criminal referral, it stayed a private, internal record rather than a police matter. That was my decision to make, and I made it, though I want to be clear I made it for my grandchildren, not for Derek or Sabrina. Derek and Sabrina signed Helen's repayment agreement 2 weeks after the dinner. The Ford Explorer was returned to the dealership within the mandatory rescission window, at a modest loss Derek absorbed personally, and the proceeds went toward the first payment. As of this telling, they are 14 months into a 60-month schedule, current on every payment, $20,067 repaid, $65,933 remaining. I check the account the way I check everything now, carefully, in writing, on a schedule, because I told myself after this that I would never again mistake love for a reason to stop verifying. Sabrina disclosed the remainder of her debt to Derek in writing, with Helen as witness. The following week, it turned out to be closer to $58,000 total, some of it debt I hadn't found in my initial trace. They are working through it together now, in marriage counseling, which Derek told me was Sabrina's idea, not his, and I think that detail matters more than almost any other detail in this story, because it's the first thing Sabrina has done since this began that wasn't handed to her by circumstance. I no longer have Derek listed as an authorized representative on any account. Instead, I met with Helen and set up something I should have set up from the start, a properly documented, limited financial power of attorney that activates only under specific, medically certified conditions. held by Helen's firm rather than by family, with Dorothy named as the person who receives notice of any activation. It is slower than what I had before. It is also the only version of help that can't be quietly turned into theft, and I built it myself, the way I built every safeguard in my life since I was 28 years old reading claims files for the first time. I still see Miles and Corinne every week. That part, I decided early, was not negotiable, and it was never really in question. This was never their fault, and I was not going to let the paperwork of adults cost two children their grandmother. Miles asked me once, a few months after the dinner, why Mommy and Daddy seemed sad for a while. I told him grown-ups sometimes make big mistakes, and the people who love them help them fix it, and that fixing something is harder than breaking it, but it's always worth doing. He thought about that for a moment and then asked if we could make cookies, which is, in its way, the correct response a 7-year-old should have to that particular truth. My cardiac procedure, for what it's worth, went perfectly. The stent is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I go back for a follow-up in 4 months, and this time, I checked 3 times that my coverage is active before I even scheduled it. Old habits. Better late than never. Sabrina and I have not fully repaired what broke that night, and I don't know that we ever will in the way people mean when they use the word repaired, like a vase glued back into its original shape. But 3 months ago she showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, with a folder of her own, her actual current credit report, printed, every line visible, no redactions. She sat at my kitchen table and said, "I wanted you to see it yourself instead of having to go find it." It was not an apology exactly. It was closer to an offering, the kind of gesture a woman like Sabrina makes instead of the words she was never taught how to say. I told her I appreciated it, and I meant it, and we drank coffee for 20 minutes and talked about Corinne's kindergarten registration instead of any of the rest of it, because some healing starts in the ordinary conversation you have anyway, not in the dramatic one you already had once. Derek comes by most Thursday evenings now, alone, sometimes to fix something around my house that doesn't actually need fixing, sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table the way he used to as a boy doing homework while I made dinner. 2 weeks ago he told me he'd started keeping his own binder, his business receipts, his loan payments, everything filed and dated the way he watched me build my case. "I figured if it's good enough to catch me," he said, half a joke, half not, "it's good enough to keep me honest going forward." I told him that was, without question, the single most useful thing he'd ever learned from his mother, and he laughed for the first time in weeks in a way that sounded like the son I raised rather than the man who sat across from me at that dinner table with his hands over his face. I still keep a binder for everything. That part of me was never going to change, and after this, I trust it more than I trust almost anything else I own. I built a file that saved $86,000, restored a life insurance policy 4 years from paying out, and, more than either of those things, forced a conversation my son and his wife needed to have with each other years before this ever happened. I did not do it to punish them. I did it because 32 years of catching other people's fraud taught me the one thing that matters more than the money: the truth, documented and undeniable, is the only thing that stops a lie from repeating itself. My name is Eleanor Voss. I spent 32 years finding the person behind the forged signature, and I never once imagined that person would be sitting at my own dinner table. But I want you to know something. If you take nothing else from this story, being underestimated by the people closest to you is not a weakness. It is, if you use it right, the exact position from which you see everything most clearly. Nobody watches carefully for the theft they don't believe their own family is capable of. I did not have that luxury of disbelief once I saw the signature. And because I looked closely instead of looking away, my grandson still has 2 parents under one roof. My son is learning, slowly, what honesty actually costs and what it's actually worth, and my policy, the one thing that was supposed to disappear, is sitting exactly where Walter and I built it to sit, waiting for my 70th birthday, the way it always should have. If someone in your life has ever had access to your paperwork and you've never once checked what they did with it, check today. Not because you assume the worst of the people you love, but because love and verification were never opposites. They only feel that way until the day you need both at once. Thank you for staying with me. If this story reminded you to check a signature, an account, or a policy you haven't looked at in years, drop a comment below and tell me what you're going to go verify tonight. If it reminded you of your own quiet strength, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the people who underestimate you are usually the ones who never checked your work.